Here is a Yamaha Natural Sound model KX-930 cassette deck. This is a recent dump find, and it's a very good dump find. This was Yamaha's top-of-the-line cassette deck for the years 1990 until 92. This was the first Yamaha cassette deck available in this titanium color. And according to the internet, this was the last Yamaha cassette deck before they slowly but surely started to do more and more cost cutting. The unit does work, and I want to point out this wonderful display. This is like a reverse LC display with a backlight. There are a few minor problems that I found so far. The first one has to do with the cassette door. As I push eject, nothing really happens. You've got to help it to open up, and then when it does open up, it opens up way too far. So clearly something is wrong with the door mechanism. It does play back, no problems there, but the next problem is when you want to stop the playback. Yeah, the stop button is missing, which does make operating this cassette deck very impractical. So let's see if we can fix at least some of these problems. Here is the cassette deck with the top cover taken off. And looking at it from the back, it might seem pretty cheap. Look at that, a plastic back panel. Well, looks are deceiving. This cassette deck is basically built inside a metal box, which makes it very service unfriendly because the bottom panel is not detachable, meaning you have to tear apart the whole entire thing to gain access to the underside of the main board. But the bottom, these side panels, and also the back panel are made from metal. So this plastic is actually just a decoration that they put on top of the metal for whatever reason. Power supply does look fine, but where are the fuses? I thought about them, but that didn't happen. So no fuses. The Dolby circuitry is on this daughter board. But I have to say, this does look nice. Here is the backlight for the LC display. These are 2 incandescent light bulbs. And then moving over to the mechanism, earlier on I forgot to mention, being a top-of-the-line cassette deck, this does have 3 heads and it does have a dual capstan drive. But unfortunately, this mechanism does already look very much like 1990s. Very small motor. The belt is still fine, but it won't be fine for much longer because it's already pretty loose. Here is the cassette deck with the faceplate taken off, and very annoyingly there is no sub-chassis for the faceplate, so half of the cassette deck, it feels like, comes out along with the faceplate. But I now have the mechanism revealed. And the first thing that we can see is right there is the spring. It has just simply disengaged from the door up here. So that's going to be an easy repair. Now the other problem is not going to be that easy to repair. As I eject the door now, as you can see, there is no more limit at all. It just comes all the way down. Simple reason, as I take this out, which is thankfully easy to do, as you can see, on either side there is this pivot point, which is the hinge itself, and then there is this, which this usually rides in a groove, and that is the stopping point for the door. Now you can see both of these pins are broken off. They are way too short to engage into that groove. In fact, I was able to find the 2 plastic pieces. There they are. That went surprisingly well. I used the soldering iron to start a pilot hole right in the middle of the broken off pin, and I then used a 3mm drill to make a proper hole. Did that on both sides, obviously. So I can now go ahead and put a 3mm screw through here, and that is the pin restored. Now, I don't want to use a screw that's any longer than this, because this is now much more solid than the original plastic pins, and if somebody rips on the cassette door, I would much prefer these screws to disengage from the grooves than have these pins breaking off. And here is the test run. I have everything reinstalled, including the spring that had disengaged. And if I now trigger the eject, nice. So that is the first problem repaired. All I have to do now is to glue the screws in place. The next problem is, of course, the missing stop button. Now, I don't have any hopes of finding that button somewhere behind this circuit board. That would be too much of a miracle. So, I found a different solution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this mute search button over here to the stop button, because I barely ever record cassettes anymore, so I don't really need the record mute function. And as for the search, well, this cassette deck has this intro scan function. So when you want to skip a track or rewind a whole track, instead of pushing search and the corresponding direction button, what you do is you just simply press intro scan. It'll do exactly the same thing, except when it then goes to play the intro, you have to be there and press play to cancel the intro scan function, because otherwise it'll continue and search for the next track. So this mute search button is kind of redundant, and therefore it can be moved. I got this circuit board loose, and of course the missing button is no longer there. You can see the buttons are all part of this plastic mold, and over time it seems like they are breaking off right there, and that's what has happened to the stop button. So what I'll do is I'm going to remove this remainder of the stop button, carefully remove this button, move it over here. I'm going to apply just a tiny little bit of glue into the corners down here to hopefully hold that in place. This is turning into quite an operation. The buttons don't sit directly up against the faceplate, so I've now made this support structure from cardboard. These two pieces will be permanent. I'm going to glue them in. This piece is temporary, just to make sure that the new button ends up sitting straight. The new stop button is in place. The thing that I didn't realize, the playback and the original stop button were just slightly longer than the buttons off to the sides. So I hate to admit, but this new stop button doesn't look right. Oh well, it's still better than nothing. I used epoxy to glue this in, so we'll see how that goes. And I've used the remainder of the epoxy to hopefully stabilize the other buttons a little bit. So you can see those shiny blobs of epoxy that I put in. Hopefully will prevent more buttons from falling out. Well, this now has to set, which is going to take about an hour. So I'm going to call it a night, and I'll be back later on.